Welcome back to the Quilty Life with Jenn, Burt. Today we're going to talk about something that a lot of you have been asking me for, and that is improv composition. What I mean by that is we are going to take all these bits and pieces that we have been making over the course of episodes 1 through 9, and we are going to turn this into a quilt top. Of course, we're going to do this in a very improv-y kind of way, since all we've been doing so far is improv, and none of our blocks match up. None of our blocks are really the same size, the same shape. We have triangle things, we have squares, we have rectangles, we have a wide variety of things. So we have to figure out how to put these things together into something that makes sense. There are a lot of ways to approach this. I have done improv composition in so many different ways that I can't even put a number on how many ways there are. And I've given this some thought. So the method I'm going to use today is one of my favorites when I have a lot of random stuff like we have here. In some cases, when you're building an improv quilt, you'll have a lot of stuff that's all the same size or nearly the same size. So for example, what if you had a bunch of stuff they were all sort of rectangles and they were close to the same size? All I would have to do here is add something to the top along here, and then these would sew together. So if you have a lot of things that are close to the same size, you can build it in a more traditional way. However, in our case here, we have a lot of stuff that's just all over the place. We have tiny, really tiny things. We have big things. We have this stripe fabric, and that's enormous. So we have lots of different things going on here. But what we've got going on is cohesiveness, because a lot of the blocks contain this fabric right here, and then we sort of pulled colors in that match that. So they sort of match, and that will allow us to make choices a little more easily. So the method we're going to use today is a method that I call building bigger blocks. So we're going to take all these tiny things and turn them into bigger rectangles, usually, of pieced stuff, and then we'll be able to put those blocks together more easily. Now you could take all of these things and put them up on your design wall and think of it that way and plan the whole thing out on your design wall before you sew anything together. That's not how I prefer to work. So we're going to do it the way I would normally do it, but obviously you can do it in any way you want. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the biggest blocks that I have. Clearly, we have the striped stuff, but I sort of want to keep this around and think of it as fabric instead of a block, because I might want to cut out chunks of this and be able to carry this stuff through the entire quilt top. So I'm going to set this aside for now and not think of this as a big block of stuff. Same thing with the slabs that we made. Remember, this was fabric that we built. These are going to be, I'm going to think of this the same way. This is going to be fabric that we can use to fill in gaps or things like that. And now what am I left with for big blocks? So these are pretty big. This block over here is pretty big. And they're relatively close to the same size. So generally what I'm going to do is start with these big blocks and then figure out the size that I want to go with. Let's try to build these things out so they're somewhere around 15 inches in at least one direction. So I think I'm going to start with the star blocks. And you could come in here and put, something on your mat to help keep you straight. I'm just going to drop these blocks over here just to keep me straight. There you go. So I know it wants to be in there. And then let's see, 15 is somewhere up around here. So we'll just sort of keep this. This is sort of our frame that we're going to work with. This is not precision, okay? So don't stress out about it. All right, so what do I like? What do we have here that I can add to this that will make me happy? And I don't want to think too far ahead about any of the other things that are going to happen. What's going to happen if I put this here and I don't like it? Just don't stress out about that at this point, right? I like this, and this sort of mirrors each other, which is kind of nice. Not exactly, but it has that sort of feel to it. And now we've got these little spots over here, so maybe we can grab some smaller bits that we've got. And as you can see, this one is it's too big for this spot. So what we could do is slide this over and put this in here, or we can make some decisions along the way about what we're going to do. There's other things we could do. We could do this. We could sew, after we sew these together and then sew something on here, then this whole thing fits on. But I think what I'm going to do is think of sliding this over this way, losing some of that background, and then putting this on here. I like what's happening here, so I am going to pause on this. I'm going to sew together what I've got here, and then I will make more decisions after that. So the way I'm going to approach this is to sew this onto this, and then I'm going to sew this onto this. Okay, so we've sewn both of those seams, and just a reminder, after I press these over on my ironing board, I like to set my big tailor's clapper. I also have small ones, but I set that on top of it and let it sit there for like 30 seconds. That makes sure that everything gets super flat and you're not working with a bunch of weird bulk. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is sew this onto this and that onto that. So this one's already pretty straight, but I'll straighten it up even a little bit more. And you can do this with or without a ruler. And this edge over here, we had already straightened that up, so that's good. And then I will trim this one as well. And as we noted earlier, this one is longer, so we need to decide where we're going to put it. And I like it about there, I think. So I'm going to sew this onto that side, and then I will come back and sew that onto that side. Okay, so now let's think about what's going on here. Remember, we were trying to get this to be 15 by 15, so somewhere in this range. So we need to add some stuff on to one side or the other to make that happen. So I think what I'm going to do is pull out some of that striped fabric. Let's look and see how much we actually need if we wanted to get this all the way out here. So this is ending up somewhere around 15. This is 10. So we need about a 5-inch strip of stripes to get this to the width we're looking for. So let's set this aside for now, and let's pull out that striped fabric. We know that we're going for 15-inch blocks, so probably the widest this needs to be is 15 inches. So if I cut right here in the middle of this green one, that's going to give me something that's a little more than 15 inches. And now we're going to cut out a chunk of this. And remember, we needed a chunk that was around 5 inches wide. And of course, I have my baby ruler here. I usually have a bigger ruler, but it's hard to do it in these videos. So you might want to use a bigger ruler. I'm going to slide this. So this is on the 10 line. And I'm going to slide it so I lose as little of this stuff off the side as possible. I don't want to lose a bunch of pieced fabric, but you can see here, if I cut along this area here, this is going to preserve the most fabric. Okay, so then we want somewhere around 5. So here's the 15. So even if you're cutting freehand, which is what I'm about to do, you can put this ruler here just as a guide, and then that way it also helps you hold down the fabric so it doesn't slide around everywhere, and it allows you to see approximately where you want to cut. So you don't always have to push your rotary cutter right up against the ruler. You can just use the ruler as a visual guide to help you cut a straight-ish line. And now we have this, and it's longer than we needed it to be. So we say, okay, well, do I want to cut this off and sew it on? Or maybe, remember, we wanted this to go up to 15. Maybe we sew something on here first and then sew these stripes onto the side. I like the idea of that. So let's figure out what we can put along here. So I dug around in what we made, and I found all of these little half square triangles that I like, and I really like the way that looks. So I think I'll sew all of those together and then sew that onto there. Now I want you to see what happened here. When I sewed these 4 things together, it turned out it shrunk in way more than I thought it was going to. You're going to lose a 1/4 inch off each side. So the more seams there are to sew, the more it's going to shrink in. And usually I do a pretty good job of thinking that through, but in this case, for some reason, I didn't think about it. So I did those 4, and then I said, oh no, it's too small. And I said, well, I got to add something else. So I didn't have any more that looked like these, but I did have this one that had a slightly different color. So I decided to go with that. So I have now sewn all of those together, and I will sew that onto that. And there we go. That looks pretty cool, I think. This is the nature of improv composition. You're going to do things that you think are great, and then you do it and you think, oh no, it's too short, or I don't like it, or I need to do something different. And you just pivot. You make a decision at that point. What if I had done this and I didn't have this? Well, I could have pulled in anything else that I've got, including I could have just pulled in, a piece of solid fabric of this or anything. So don't feel like you're just stuck with the bits you've got. You can always pull in. You could make something new if you needed to, and then get it on there. All right. So don't stress out about it. Do what feels right in the moment and just make decisions as you go, and don't stress out about it so much. Okay, so next up, so this onto that, we need a straight edge first. I'm going to come in without a ruler and go like that. And now, before I sew it on, I think, okay, I could shift this up and down a bit because I'm a bit longer, or I could turn it around this way if I wanted to. I think I like it better this way, so I'm going to sew it on in this direction. So there we go. We have made ourselves a block that's approximately 15 by 15 or so. We don't have to stress out about getting exactly the right size, but this is our first bigger block. And I like working this way because you don't have to think about the whole quilt at the same time. You're just concentrating on making this one small thing. So this is our first bigger block, and I am not going to come in here and trim anything off because I don't know exactly what I want to do with it yet. So I'm not going to make any decisions until I have to. All right, and we have this square and a square and a square and a square, which is a pretty big block. So I think I'm going to start there. And here's our line. Here's our line. We want to build it out to here-ish. All right, so what are we going to do with this? Let's think about the other stuff that we've got. This is very pink and blue, and if we want it to go together with the other thing that we have, we need to make sure that we add some of those darker colors, and we need to definitely make sure we get some of this fabric in there. So let's think about what we've got. This looks okay, but these are sort of not the right size. I'm going to have to add things on, and do I like that this is going out? Kind of. So this is sort of like mirroring these out here. I kind of like that look. So what else do we have? Let's look. We had these orange ones that we made. And I actually really kind of like this. So I wasn't expecting this. I just started pulling and I said, oh, well, I actually really like where this is going. But now I have a lot of mismatched sizes to deal with. This is clearly not close to the right size. And these go in weird shapes and stuff like that. So we need to figure out how we're going to deal with this. So the first thing I'm going to look at is, all right, if I come in here and maybe somehow put in these, that might work, but I think it's going to take away this fabric. There's a lot of that going on, and I think that might take away from things. And oh, I just realized I have a big one of these. Woohoo! All right, so let's put that one on that side, and then we don't have to compensate for this one as much. So I think what is speaking to me at the moment is maybe to add on some solid fabric here in the corners. So let's go to our scrap bowl and see what we've got. So we do have this nice orange that we've used for a lot of stuff, and maybe that would look pretty nice here. So let's think about that. So if I put orange in all of these spots, I'm just sort of scattering this around. That's not a big enough piece, obviously, but I want to see what's going on. I think that would look kind of nice, and this would sort of frame this all out. So I think that's what I'll do is I'll cut some pieces to try to fill in these gaps here. Now, before I start cutting up pieces and sewing things together, let's think about the construction process. So how am I going to sew all of this together? If I just willy-nilly start cutting out pieces, I don't really know how I'm going to put this together. So at this point, this is where I stop and say, okay, construction, think about how that's actually going to work. So I know this piece is big enough, so I could just go ahead and sew that on. But this one over here on this side is coming in this angle. So we need to add something onto these before we sew it on. And the reason I say that is if we sew something on here, something on there, then we can come straight in here and cut that off and then add the pieces on like that. So let's figure out what we're going to add on to this. Now, maybe we want to come in here and add on exactly the same color that was there before. So I happen to have these two triangles that are the right fabric, and if I sew those on to the sides, then I'll have a big enough chunk. I'm going to go with this. Okay, and that method that I just showed you is a very common thing that you're going to have to do when you do improv composition. It's called coping. So if they're strips, people usually refer to them as coping strips. In this case, we have what? Coping triangles? I don't know. I don't know what you call them when they're triangles, but it's just adding on extra when you need there to be extra. Okay, so I've now cut a straight side on that. There's already a straight side on this, and I am not going to go ahead and cut these down first. I'm going to sew them on, and then I will cut all the way across. Okay, there we go. So now let's cut straight off this side and this side. For this side over here, I am going to use this because it was already pretty straight, and I'm going to use that as my guide to cut that, and then also slide it up there and use it again to cut that. And then I'll do the same sort of thing on this side. So I've now got this middle part in a bigger chunk that makes it easier to figure out how much I need to add on each side so that I have a big enough piece to sew on. So let's start down here on the bottom part. So I'm going to look at these strips, and that's pretty nice. So I'm going to cut off a chunk of fabric that's about that big. And there is selvage here, so I'm going to pre-cut that off so I don't accidentally leave selvage in my quilt. All right, so I'm going to come in here and sew this on. Now, one thing I want to pay attention to is that this is straight and this one is sort of at an angle. Do I like this angle? Do I want to keep this angle? And my answer personally is yes. So what I'm going to probably do is come in and then just flip this over and sew that onto that. And then I maintain that. If you didn't like that and you wanted it more straight, just straighten that up first before you sew it on, and then you won't end up with an angle there. Okay, there we go. So now we need another piece of orange here, and we're going to get really close to being too small on this side. So let's just go with, I've got a bigger chunk of the orange, so let's just work with a larger chunk so we don't run the risk of running out of fabric. So I'm going to sew this onto this, and again I'm going to keep that wonky angle out there, so I'm going to sew this onto this like that. All right, cool. And now let's just straighten up that edge, and that's done. So I could go ahead and just sew this on here, but I think what I'll do first is add the orange onto those chunks just like I did here first. Okay, so I made this and it's too short, so that was a mistake. There's no mistakes in improv. It's just an opportunity to add something interesting into what's going on. So how are we going to deal with this? So let's look at what's going on here. This angle is odd. So are we going to lose some of this anyway? Let's think about that. So if I cut this off more square, then maybe it's not as short as I think it is. Let's look at that. So I'm just going to cut this off, and I'm going to lose that tip right there, and I'm okay with that. That's totally fine. I'm going to cut this off, and now, is our problem as bad as we thought it was? It's pretty much the right size. So that worked for us. So now this is extra long. So now we can decide where we want it to be. Do we want it to line up pretty much with that one, or do we want the points to line up more? And look at that. That's looking pretty cool. So we basically just built on and made our square and a square and a square even more. We sort of added a weird wonky-ish kind of square around the outside. And I really love the way this looks. Now, why do I like the way this looks? It's very busy and the colors really don't seem to match. There's a lot of things going on here, right? There's a lot of reasons you may be looking at this and thinking, wow, I really hate that. I would never make that. And, you're free to hate this. So if you look at this and think, wow, that's really chaotic. Yes, but at the same time, there is some sort of order to it. And that's what I usually like to try to do. When I have lots of chaos going on, I like to force some order of some sort. So in this case, adding these oranges here, having these blues here and these oranges here, and then also sort of using the same shapes going out, that sort of forces some order on to the chaos. Now let's look at the size that we've got going on now. So it's definitely wide enough, and it's a little bit short this way. So what do we want to do? So we could just say, this is good enough. It's close enough to the right size. And I'm not going to make any more decisions about this until I see where it's going to go in the rest of the composition. Because what if the thing I want to put next to this is extra big? So what I'm going to decide at this point is to not add anything else onto this. I'm just going to save this for later and see what happens. And as before, I'm not going to come in here and trim off anything off these blocks because I want to see where we go with this later. Now, when I started filming this episode, I thought I'm going to be able to finish the entire quilt top within one episode, but I am second guessing myself now. If you hadn't noticed, I do my videos improv, so I don't overthink them too much before I get started. So that's what's happening in this case. I am adjusting and I am changing things at the last minute. So this episode is going to be a two-parter. So we're going to have episode 10 is going to be one part, and then we're going to roll it into episode 11 where we'll actually finish the quilt top. So I'll see you back here next time for the next episode of the Quilty Life with me, Jenn George Burt.